when the will is triggered, when you really decide this is something, for whatever reason, that is worth my committing to, and that amazing things can happen.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our sixth Afternoon Light Live for 2026. Today's conversation is a particularly special one for us here at the Robert Menzies Institute because we're going to take you in a behind-the-scenes tour of our major new exhibition, Robert Menzies, the man who made modern Australia. And this exhibition seeks not just to recount the life of Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister, but to explore the deeper question of how modern Australia itself was made. So our guest today is Alex McDermott, the exhibition's curator. Alex is a historian, an author, a documentary producer, and one of Australia's most thoughtful public historians. Many of you might know Alex from his work at the Museum of Australian Democracy, or his book, Australian History For Dummies. And he makes many contributions to documentaries, to books and civic history projects across the country, and is also a regular contributor to the Australian and the Australian Financial Review. But I think what distinguishes Alex's work particularly is his ability to tell history not just as a collection of dates and artefacts, but as a living story about who we are as Australians and how we came to inherit the society we live in today. And that very spirit sits at the heart of this exhibition. This exhibition is not merely about one political figure. It's an exhibition about aspiration, democracy, education, family, citizenship, and national identity. It asks why so much of the Australia we still recognise, or perhaps now miss, emerged during this Menzies era. An Australia of home ownership, expanding universities, social mobility, stable institutions, and, I think most importantly, confidence in our liberal democracy. One of the things I find most compelling about this exhibition is the way it grounds these big national ideas in the deeply human stories. From Menzies' humble upbringing in Western Victoria in Jeparit, to the objects uncovered through Alex's remarkable journey to Jeparit, including family photos, ceremonial silver trowel, and even a small jar of soil from Menzies' place of birth. These artefacts remind us that no leader emerges in a vacuum. They're formed by their families, their communities, the institutions and experiences that shape their understanding of duty and nationhood. Welcome to Afternoon Light Live,
Georgina,
Alex.
thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure over the past year working with you on this exhibition with Victoria Feronis, our assistant curator. When we approached you, you have a very deep background in Australian history, of course, but this was, I think, your first project working on Robert Menzies, the person, particularly. Yeah. What was it that captured you about Robert Menzies as a subject for this exhibition?
I guess it was two big things. One was the degree to which he's the confluence of these sort of deep historical rivers and embodies and articulates these traditions in Australian democracy and Australian history, the broad liberal culture that sort of infused colonial Australia throughout the 19th century was one. A deep Burkean, sort of small c conservative reverence for the contributions and achievements of previous generations is another. And also, so Menzies was born in 1894 in Jeparit, and he was growing up and coming of age in the late 1890s, early 1900s. And he, I think, in the sort of the classrooms of the time, the civics, textbooks, and the general culture was really big on the sort of on what you'd call civic liberalism, which is what Federation was one of the great sort of signal triumphs of, and an emphasis on sort of rights mixed with sort of mutual duties and what we owe each other and a shared common identity. And I think Menzies' own capacity to articulate those things is actually underrated. because he's almost deliberately downbeat in how he addresses people and addresses audiences. And so it's sort of the deep, profound common sense in what he's saying. Sometimes I would go back and read it 2 or 3 times over, just trying to see how these seemingly sort of simple, clear phrases were, building on very deep roots and deep traditions. So that's one. The other is just basically the argument we make with the exhibition itself, which you see in the title, The Man Who Made Modern Australia.
Yes, and I think we were saying before, when people come in and see that title and it's on a grand display at the entrance, there's some who just nod and say, yes, of course. And there are others who say, really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Wasn't that Whitlam?
Yeah. Right.
So why do you think Menzies is the man who made modern Australia?
Well, I think, I'll pan back a step. So when we started working on it, on the exhibition, it fairly quickly became apparent that our task was actually not to reintroduce Robert Menzies, but actually introduce him to generations of Australians who had not met him before. And so it wasn't going to be a case of change everything you thought about Robert Menzies. We've got something else to tell you. Here's this guy, here's this man you really need to know about and who speaks to you. And so why is he the man who made modern Australia? There's the obvious foundational pillars you were mentioning before in the intro, sort of housing, a liberal philosophy, ANZUS, Defence Alliance,
home
ownership, modern universities, all these things that we now think of as intrinsic to the Australian way of life, really bedded down through policies that he drove over more than 15 years of a hard prime ministerial government. So there's that. But also, given that this exhibition is in Melbourne University and so many of the people coming in are young students in their 20s, teenagers, local students, regional students, international students, we sort of realised the dialogue had to be really, really direct. And essentially, it struck us that Menzies is the man who understood what our dreams are, and the things like the desire for a home of your own, a chance to get ahead, a chance to make the life that you want with your family and so forth. And I mean, these things are perennial, but they're extremely current. And I think in everything that Menzies did, you can see that basic preoccupation, which really speaks to us today as well.
I guess one thing that could be said about the title of the exhibition, sort of in rebuttal to it, is that Menzies is the man who made post-war Australia, but did he make modern Australia? And this sort of idea that, when did modernity arrive? I mean, is it the 80s? For a kid here at Melbourne Uni who's 18, 19, maybe 2000, Y2K, maybe that's modern Australia. So what is modern Australia? And I mean, is that a constantly moving feast? And in which case, are we really talking about post-war Australia?
Well, if you look around this, if you go down to Melbourne, the city today, and walk around, go out into the suburbs, what you see is the Australia that Menzies was the signal architect of. So an Australia with mass university education that is open to the region and people coming from overseas, not being shut out for purely racial or other discriminatory reasons. Yeah, home ownership was I think when he came into office, it was in maybe the low to mid 40%. I have a sneaky look at Zach Gorman.
I think we say 53% in 1947.
Right.
And then by
so
the
maybe
time
it's just
he leaves,
New South Wales. It was in the 40s.
And then by the time he leaves,
it's over 70%.
71%.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's
amazing transformation.
Yeah. And for decades, you then take that for granted until it goes away.
Yeah.
So there's things like that. On the question of when did we become modern, it's interesting because you had someone like Donald Horne in The Lucky Country, for instance, who came of age. Well, The Lucky Country comes out in 1964 and it basically announces that this Menzies show is an old Edwardian rerun and the real Australia is being born now. And that was sort of embraced by the baby boomers and by Gough Whitlam and the vista of the new and these visions of new change, that this sense that Menzies had just inherited some antediluvian sort of pre-flood world that was now coming to life. But to counter that, there's an exhibit we have in the other room that is of April 1960, the front page of Time magazine in America. And Time commissioned William Doble to do a portrait of Menzies. And I think from memory, the headline on the front page was something like, "Things are looking up down under." And they devoted a 5,000-word article to what was happening in Australia. And they literally described it as Australia's coming of age under Menzies. And for them, it was a signal departure, the encouragement of free enterprise and an egalitarian free society was something that they saw as being significantly different to the decades that had preceded. And I think Menzies is actually underrated for the degree of strong liberal democratic values that he brought into the mainstream of Australia and really embedded there. And there's a great argument that I think David Kemp makes in his multi-volume history. He points out that Gough Whitlam's subsequent success becoming Prime Minister and his achievements, debatable as some of them may be, were actually resulted from him accepting the Australia that Menzies had made, a suburban, flourishing, free Australia, and rather than pursuing the politics of class war, actually trying to sort of commandeer it or at least build on that. And I think that's a really powerful argument that what Whitlam and, Fraser, Hawke, Keating, Howard, Costello all managed to then create afterwards was all built on this really profoundly strong bedrock that Menzies and his government was able to build.
And I think you've mentioned suburbia, this sort of idea that he represented the birth of suburban Australia, of middle Australia. But his origin story is quite different from that. And I guess that's where people like Donald Horne would paint him as a sort of an Edwardian figure out of touch with suburban middle Australia. And of course, we can have a debate about that. But tell me about the origin story. We're sitting in this room, which I call the Jeparit room because it's covered in beautiful photos of Jeparit in Western Victoria. It's almost 400 kilometres from Melbourne. It takes about 5 hours to drive there. It's certainly off the beaten track. You went there last year on a pilgrimage of sorts to discover Jeparit for yourself.
I did.
So tell me what you found and what you brought back.
Yeah, I'm so glad I went. It was very significant for me in trying to put together I don't want to be cheap and tabloid about this, but the human picture, as it were, of the public man. And I have to stop at the question about how much Menzies would understand about suburbia. I guess the thing about suburbia is the same thing that was in Jeparit in the 1890s and 1900s, and that's family and families and local communities. And I went out there last October and was very warmly welcomed by the people of Jeparit and the Historical Society there, and able to spend some time just getting a sense of the place itself where Menzies had come from. And what I was struck by correlated with ways that Menzies described it as a place to grow up. And that was, family was so clearly significant for life and for what he described as independence, sort of the sane, solid foundation there. And the very beginnings of Menzies, what struck me was how it was about as far away from the metropolitan centre of power or prestige as you could get. He's born in the back of the general store, which is owned and run by his father and his mother. And I was so struck by this that I sort of went out of my way to procure some of the soil from the site when he was born. And that continues to be for me, that's my personal favourite part of the exhibition. So I get it's so talismanic, wow. But I'm profoundly affected by just this idea of here is this boy hundreds of kilometres from the centres as it was in the colonial world, it didn't look very Edwardian or Victorian in the sort of the British monarchical sense of the words. It was right out on the fringes, and it was a community that was in the first decade of its life and deploying what you call free associations. So the Wesleyans and the Australian Natives Association and other sort of self-organising groups that Menzies' father was extremely pivotal part of. And I started to get a sense of a boy growing up in and around a general store where farmers are coming in and living for months on credit that is being extended to them by James Sr., Robert's father, and James, the father, playing such an incredibly proactive role in ensuring that the community helps each other in progressing and prospering. And that's even before you start talking about the stunning nature that you're surrounded by, which we've tried to give some sense of in this room of the exhibition. And normally when we're not recording podcasts, we also have the large screen at the back plays footage from the Wimmera River and the Corella cockatoos, which Georgina, with the office next door to it, you'll be becoming increasingly familiar with.
I am a little desensitised to it now.
But it's just beautiful. It's just, and you get, and it's just an atmospheric sense.
Yeah.
And I think that's really powerful too.
For the benefit of those not in the room, near this little jar of soil from the site of Menzies' place of birth, there's a quote from Menzies' Forgotten People broadcast. One of the best instincts in us is that which induces us to have one little piece of earth with a house and a garden, which is ours.
Right.
And I look at that and I look at the earth that you collect, or the soil you collected, and I mean, it is. It's
I'm so glad you make that connection.
It's very, very moving. But the other thing that's important about Jeparit, of course, is its education.
Yeah.
It's a humble town.
Yeah.
There's one school for the entire town. You can visit the school, although it's been moved from the site it used to be in, but it's really, really, really small. But Menzies was really bright and had great aspirations, worked hard, scholarship to a private school in Ballarat, lived with his grandma there, scholarship to Wesley College, and then, of course, the scholarship, one of 25 in the state, a scholarship to Melbourne Uni to bring him to these storied halls. So respect that his parents had for education and the potential of education to be transformative, it lived with him forever, really.
Yeah.
And I'd pick up another quote on this wall about the university, and you'll have to read it, Alex, because I am slightly on the wrong angle here.
Before I read the university one, can we just go back to Jeparit?
Yes, yeah.
Let me tell you a story. So he's in a family growing up, which is a family of book readers, and that's very clear. And he's nourished by that from very early on. But there's this, to me, wonderfully revealing anecdote that he retells, maybe in his memoir, about being at the age of 8 or 9, perhaps, and essentially a travelling quack comes to the village, a phrenologist, which is that disreputable 19th century pseudoscience where they would read your skull and tell you what sort of person you were like, what motivated you, and what your future was, and so forth. Anyhow, the quack in question reads Bob Menzies' skull and says to him, "Oh, you have a bit of a talent for oratory. I'm seeing something like public service, or maybe a lawyer or something prominent, something big." And how Robert describes it as a moment that ignited something for him. And he went home, and as he tells it, from that moment, committed to big things, to going beyond the horizon that was nearby. And the road that he was going to pursue was education and scholarships. And when we had the launch, Tony Abbott was kind enough to come and launch it, and we're walking around, and I was showing him the phrenology advertisement that sort of gives me an excuse to tell the story. And Tony chuckled and said, It's striking, isn't it? When the will is triggered, when you really decide this is something for whatever reason that is worth my committing to, and that amazing things can happen.
Yeah.
I crudely paraphrased Tony, but essentially that was the sentiment. And obviously you need more than the prediction of a quack to go on to become Australia's greatest ever Prime Minister.
That if he hadn't met the phrenologist on the day,
you have to wonder.
He would have still been intent on scholarships and excellence and public service.
But it is significant. The outro of that anecdote is he goes to Ballarat, and from Ballarat he pursues scholarships to Wesley College of Melbourne and then on to the University of Melbourne. And that was about as exceedingly narrow a path as you could imagine at the time. I think he said out of 25 scholarships to the University of Melbourne. And I think there's another object that we exhibit in the other room is what we call the birth certificate documents of Australia's modern university system, which is the Murray Report, a commission conducted for Menzies in the late 1950s. And it's from that we get a modern higher education system that is open to the vast majority of Australians. And in my mind, I connect the path that he blazed and the path that he trod, and a very deep sense that education was the way he made his way forward in life and how he attained the places that he got to. And I think he considered that one of his greatest achievements, the securing a modern university higher education system in Australia.
Yeah. And would you be able to read that quote out that I can't actually read?
Now's a good moment.
Yeah.
The university, and this was 1916 when he was editor of the Melbourne University magazine. The university must realise, we must all realise, that our responsibility to the community is a tremendous one. Having received much, we must give much. And at the start of our conversation, I was talking about the civic liberalism that he absorbed. That really comes through extremely strongly when you're reading the articles and editorials he was writing whilst he was at uni. This sort of civic sense of reciprocity, and we are all fellows in this shared nation and this shared place. And if we've gained great things, then it's emboldened upon us to also give back.
Yeah. Absolutely. We, of course, have got to 27 minutes in and I've only got up to question 4 out of 11. So I'm really racing through here, Alex. My final question, and he's still in his 20s at this stage.
Still in Japan.
Okay. We've left Japan. We're at Melbourne Uni now. We're at Melbourne Uni. We're still in this room though.
Yeah.
The conscription debates. So 1916 and 17, we have 2 referenda on conscription. Prime Minister Billy Hughes is in favour. The Australian public are against. Robert Menzies campaigns for conscription and he's obviously on the losing side. It was a really, really vigorous, in some ways violent debate here at Melbourne University. You had people thrown in the lake. You had boycotts and deplatforming and cancellation. I mean, I often say this is the first instance of cancel culture on a university campus in Australia, the conscription debates. Menzies does not serve in World War I. 2 of his brothers do, but he does not. His parents say he mustn't do that. He commits himself to a life of public service through politics as a sort of, I guess, atonement for not going to World War I. But you've got on display 4 very powerful posters from those debates. What was it about those debates and Menzies' role in them and the connection to the place here at Melbourne University that drew you to highlighting that aspect of his early life, really?
I found myself gravitating towards conscription for the significance of it in Menzies' own individual life trajectory, but also the significance for the place where we're sitting, Melbourne University, and that's for quite ferocious national debate, and the significance of it for our democratic story. There was such a neat superimposing of these 3 things. And to go from the top down, the national story is we were the only nation to put the question of whether or not there should be conscription, compulsory enlistment to an electorate in World War I. You can make, to my mind, a very good argument. There were strong democratic arguments each way. Again, the need for mutual sacrifice, and to share that burden that is the argument for conscription and the argument for individual freedom of conscience for the other way. So that's significant. Melbourne University because we went so hard on Japarut, feel a bit bad for Melbourne University. That doesn't get as much of a Guernsey here, but it gets it there. But for Menzies individually, this is what I found really compelling for the story of the exhibition is, again, how he describes it later in his life is that the experience of the stigma of not serving when clearly every fibre of his being wanted to go and serve. But due to the family decision that, no, this son was going to stay, he wasn't able to. It made conscription very personal for him. If conscription was passed, he would be able to go and serve. It wasn't passed, and so he remained at home in Australia. And it was used as a jibe by rivals and others for many decades to come. And the way Menzies himself described it is as a searing experience. And coming out of it, his feeling was, well, I have to do something to show that I also am contributing back to the nation. And that was his reasoning for entering public life. And I found that just one of those really extraordinary, pivotal milestone moments in the trajectory of his life, and it served as almost a launch pad onto the rest of his career, which is the other room that we haven't got around to talking about much today.
And that's certainly how his daughter Heather Henderson tells the story as well through her writings and speaking to her. Although I guess another question we can't ask, of course, he's long gone, is, I mean, there were people who, boys who would sneak off and just sign up anyway against the wishes of their family, and he didn't do that, whether that reflects an honour he had for his parents and I guess a conservatism or... Anyway, we will never know. And by the way, no, I'm sorry. No. I'm sorry, Alex. You're not going to have a go because we are now 3 minutes into our audience Q&A and I need to respect that.
That's so frustrating.
For another time. Okay. Robert Menzies Institute board member Timothy Lynch has asked, is Robert Menzies' contribution to our politics the equivalent of FDR's to American politics? How might we understand his greatness in relative terms?
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's hard because you're not an expert in US political history, of course.
I have to invite Timothy up onto the microphone. Okay. This response isn't too feeble, but the one thing that does immediately register in my mind is FDR's fireside chats.
Yeah.
And in the second room, what we do in the second room is essentially doing Menzies' public career and defining it to three key themes with three key objects. And one is a microphone, the other is his desk, and the third is his camera. And the microphone is for us. And Menzies in the public conversation of democracy. And there's figures like Stanley Baldwin and later Winston Churchill in Britain, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt in America in the 1930s, who during the Depression pioneers those fireside chats, these regular broadcasts to the nation. And in Australia, during the Second World War, Menzies pioneers the Forgotten People broadcasts, which really revolutionises the national conversation. And you can see this transformation occurring in each nation at about that time. And for Menzies, it's underrated because he's so often down tempo and isn't full of rhetorical flights. But his capacity to not yell at people is profound and much underrated. And the way in which he used the technology of radio to enter into people's homes, into their living rooms, their kitchens and places, and the tonality of the conversation and the freedom with which it gave him to speak to women as well as men. Whereas previous to that, most political oratory was either at the street corner or at the town hall, the sort of more public, masculinized places. And I think when we think of Menzies and, for instance, suburban Australia and mainstream Australia, I think it's not possible to sort of divorce that from the way and the degree to which he pioneered that massive shift in the public conversation.
I think the gift he had at communicating was clear, was apparent. And as you say, FDR as well through the fireside chat, Stanley Baldwin. I'm thinking of other great communicators like John Howard would make put a lot of effort into talkback radio.
Yeah.
So talking directly to people, not to the journalists, because that's the problem. If you use journalists as your conduit, there's a disconnect. And look, whether you love him or hate him, Donald Trump on Truth Social, you don't, I mean, he doesn't even believe in the mainstream media. He just wants to get the message straight to you through his own social media platform. But that sense that I'm talking to you, Alex, I'm not talking to a journalist who then will report on what I said to eventually getting to you.
Absolutely.
And creating barriers. A question from online audience, a name very familiar to you, Alex, Henry Ergas. Henry asks, what do you think Menzies had in common with and what separates him from British Conservatives, and what are the implications for the present day? Great question.
Yeah.
Glad it's you answering that, not me.
Thank you, Henry, for that truly terrifying question.
There's actually a chapter in our upcoming book on Menzies in the British Commonwealth of Nations by Kit Covell. Yes, on the influence that Menzies had on British conservatism, obviously in that World War II period where they were really going through a lot of difficulties. Yeah,
I think that one of the things that's striking about British conservatism and Menzian liberalism is the convergence. The decades leading up to Menzies coming to prominence, the degree to which they started to share characteristics because of changing circumstances, that by the time that Menzies was in federal politics in the 1930s, you had both in Britain and in Australia, the British Conservatives and what then became the Australian Liberals were the sole non-Labor party. And in that sense, Britain was playing catch-up with Australia because our different liberal groupings had fused in 1908, 1909, and that didn't happen in Britain until the 1920s, where the Lloyd George's Liberals sort of coalition collapsed and got absorbed largely by Baldwin's Conservatives. And so what you started to find there was a lot of profound overlap in the way they were prosecuting the conversation with the public. And for both, it was property owning and having a stake in the country, and home ownership were deeply significant, and an emphasis on the threat of socialism and an overbearing state and other things like that. But also with both Baldwin and with Menzies, and sort of a conversational ease with just the vast ordinary majority of English and Australians. And I think that's set up something quite profound. And I think it's too easy for us to get caught up in the difference of name tags. And just as one example, I'd just cite, I think something Keith Hancock in his wonderful 1930 book called Australia described. He said, in Australia now, if you get up in a public debate and announce yourself a Liberal, then the audience automatically assumes you mean Conservative. And that to me just sort of points to the degree to which we can get too preoccupied about whether a capital L Liberal and a capital C Conservative were inherently different or otherwise. And the very last thing I'd say about that is Menzies' language is it's part of, I would call it a genius, the genius of combining a deep liberal philosophy with a profound conservative instinct and sensibility. And it's merged seamlessly. And the great British Conservative Prime Ministers, I think you also see that prominently as well, certainly the 20th century.
I think there are some key differences. Henry did ask about what separates Menzies from British Conservatives. I wonder, the idea of noblesse oblige, this one nation Tories are of the land, of the the aristocracy. But they, are benevolent and they want to lead the country in order to look after the poor and needy. Menzies doesn't share those sentiments.
No, he doesn't. No. But also, in fairness to the British Tories, I think that's more a pejorative that's thrown at them by the time you get to the 1930s and 40s. The emphasis is the sort of Tory democracy and is on ordinary home ownership, and certainly, say, Maggie Thatcher growing up in Grantham in England is sort of absorbing a much more, even call it egalitarian or person-to-person type of conservatism. I'm not here to set up a stall for British conservatives, but I'm just saying I think that the Disraelian 19th century sort of noblesse oblige is peeling off by the time that Menzies and Baldwin and others are coming onto the scene.
Margaret Thatcher, as Prime Minister, comes to Australia just after Menzies dies and delivers the Menzies Lecture for this Robert Menzies Lecture Trust that was created by Monash University Liberal Club students. And she really admires him in this lecture, although I think in policies, the Menzies sort of economic agenda of the 50s and 60s would be quite divergent from her Reagan Thatcher agenda of the sort of Friedman Hayek free market economics.
But the moral vocabulary is remarkably similar.
Yeah.
And which she deploys and which Menzies deployed as well. But I certainly take your point about the difference in economic policy.
Maybe a column for you and Henry to unpack in future. A question from Gary here, and I think this question is extremely pertinent given we've had the current Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese, talking about this great Australian dream and wanting to make it available to young people through his Treasurer's budget that was announced on Tuesday. Does the Australian dream of the Menzies era still exist, and what does it look like today?
To some strong extent, what it is the standard by which we judge the present. And again, going back to our early question about why was it that Menzies made modern Australia, he almost authenticated our dreams, sort of, and made home ownership and things like that just a baseline assumption that we expect each rising generation to be able to enjoy. And that's clearly not the case nowadays. And if Menzies, I'll happily speak on behalf of Menzies at this point. If he was here today, I think he would be profoundly disturbed by that difficulty that we're currently trying to navigate our way through.
People often remark to me, what would Menzies think of the state of universities today too, not just home ownership, but the universities and how they deliver for Australian students and this Australian community, as we've seen in that quote. Another question here relating to Menzies and his American presidential counterparts, and he had 5 US presidential counterparts, such as his longevity in office, only 1 Republican and 4 Democrats, and he did not get on with the Republican, but that's not the question. This is about actually a Democrat. What did you learn about Menzies and John F. Kennedy? How important was that relationship? Where is the photo from the exhibition from? So if you haven't seen the exhibition in the other room, there's a lovely photo of Menzies and JFK sitting on armchairs, looking very comfortable in each other's company.
Yeah, and which is sort of wonderfully deceptive, because I think the photo was taken maybe July 1963, and the year before, Australia had been justifiably concerned by the Indonesian border infractions in Papua, which was an Australian protectorate at the time. And Indonesia was governed by Sukarno, who was close to the Soviet Union and so forth. And the Menzies government quietly asked the Kennedy government if Australian territory was to be actively violated and invaded, would that be a case when the relevant clause from the ANZUS Treaty might be invoked? And I don't think Kennedy came back with a point-blank refusal, but it was pretty clear that that was not a fait accompli. That was not a definite yes.
I think he basically said, don't think the ANZUS applies to that situation. Don't think America would come to Australia's aid. And then I think one of his advisors said, And this is, as you say, 1963. The ANZUS was signed in 1951. He said no one remembers ANZUS.
You shocked me, Georgina. I was not aware of that.
12 years
that's
later.
quite amazing.
And now 75 years later, we're still talking about it. And it still exists.
Yeah.
Yeah. In rudish health.
In health.
In health.
But so for me, the takeaway from that is Menzies' response to that effective repudiation, which was twofold. It was to dramatically transform the ADF, transform it into effectively a modern fighting force that could do two things at once. It could defend the northern approaches, it could defend Australia's territorial integrity, but also it was well capable of engaging as an alliance partner globally as well. And sort of in an example of being able to walk and chew gum at the same time, rather than treating it as an either-or thing. And when Vietnam came along and America was looking for nations who might be able to participate in that regional conflict, Australia was in a much more significantly better place to contribute than if those changes weren't underway.
The photo was taken, as far as I'm aware, in the Oval Office. Is that right? I think it was.
I thought it was. I'm not going to dispute.
We won't. It might be fake news. Another question: who are the key figures in Menzies' life who influenced him personally and professionally, and how they reflected in this exhibition?
Oh, okay. So his father, very, very obviously, and also not obviously. So his father was, in many ways, an inspiring figure, but also a figure that, in some ways, alarmed young Robert. And part of the alarm came in the fact that his father was highly emotional in his public rhetoric, and he was a lay preacher and also became a politician, a shire councillor, and so forth. And Menzies describes sitting in the congregation or in the crowd and shrinking into himself when watching his father get started. And
potentially on a soapbox like the one over there.
On a soapbox, which we have there. And in fact, which Menzies would stand on and do imitations of different people to his schoolmates in Japarut, and I suspect also of his father when his father wasn't watching. So that's a signal one. I think, in the field of law, Owen Dixon was deeply significant. In Australian politics, it's, to me, very interesting that he enters politics as, could call it ginger group, part of the young nationalists. So it's the effectively post-war liberals who are disheartened at what the then Liberal Party, as it was called, the National Party, was doing or failing to do. And they wanted to bring liberalism and public-spirited engagement back into politics. And so it wasn't quite a generational revolt, but it was something that he and close peer friends and associates brought in. And to me, that's actually one of the striking things about Menzies. There are some great figures who you can sort of see that it's not quite the laying on of hands, but you can see the sort of the transmission from key mentors and those who guide the person in question. Menzies seems to have, from very early on, had a very sort of an autonomous, self-driving, self-guiding capacity, even as he was absorbing like everything from Magna Carta through Wordsworth, through other things as well, sort of the broader river of the culture that he was nourished by. But I'm always struck by, in a sense, that the lack of significant mentoring, assisting figures in his life.
But I mean, you mentioned Sir Owen Dixon, who really was quite a significant figure.
He doesn't get apologies to the Owen Dixon fans out there.
He doesn't get a book.
Doesn't get as much representation in this exhibition as he argued.
Someone you didn't mention, who is worth mentioning, he wasn't, of course, alive in Menzies' life, was Edmund Burke. So for the benefit of our online audience, over there is a book plate created for Robert Menzies by Lionel Lindsay of a little boy we think it's on the banks of the Wimmera River, yabbying, and right up the top is Edmund Burke's face,
his bust.
And then in the display over there, you have a book by Edmund Burke, and this idea that he really was heavily influenced by Burke's ideas,
he
writings, and that fed into his own political philosophy that he developed.
Yeah, and again, going back to the previous question, books were his mentors as much as the people that he was deriving assistance and guidance from, I think. And Burke's signal.
Another question here. I'd like to know the answer to this, actually. Which item or display in the exhibition do you hope young Australians take most notice of?
Oh, what a great question.
The soil.
I'll go to the soil again, won't I?
You can't. You've done the soil.
I won't.
You have to do something else.
Yeah, I think I should do something from the other room. It's hard to tear my attention away from the soapbox, though, which is right behind us, which is of the period, which is Menzies as a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old mucking around with his mates and getting into practice with debating and arguing. And that goes to the microphone cluster of objects we have in the other room, which is from the very beginning, Menzies is aware of. There's a great definition by Geoffrey Blainey, which is democracy is government by discussion and government by debate. And I think for Menzies, that was so powerful. And I think I would love if younger Australians were also absorbing that idea and that proposition as well, because I think too much in our current days, different and opposing ideas and arguments are treated as sort of pathology that we need to eliminate rather than the actual lifeblood of a genuinely healthy democratic polity. So that's what I would go to.
That's great. Do you want to know mine? Not interviewing me, but anyway. The book of Winston Churchill's speeches with the inscription in it from Winston Churchill, dated, I think, August 1938. And so, Menzies would have just met Churchill. And so it's pre-World War II, and it's so haunting. And it says something like, it was a pity these warnings were not heeded. Yeah. And this is in 1938.
Yeah, and the book is called Arms and the Covenant, which is a collection of Churchill addresses in the 1930s in his wilderness years, where he was trying to lift consciousness of the dangers that surrounded the democratic nations at the time. And I think clearly perhaps a not too subtle dig at Robert himself, given that he was part of a government under Joseph Lyons at the time that was committed to appeasement, a policy of appeasement, even though Menzies himself was at least beginning to appreciate the dangers and starting to argue in cabinet for greater defence measures and so forth against the arguments of others. But that's a great one. And it goes nicely with the scarf that was given by Winston Churchill's daughter to Robert Menzies' daughter, Heather, during World War II. Which we have on the other side of the exhibition.
With the World War II slogans. Yeah. Now we have just 2 minutes left, and I've got lots of these questions to get through, so I'm just going to choose my favourite. Oh, here we go. This is a good one. This is not a quick one. Why is it that Menzies' forward policies on immigration are so often overshadowed by the White Australia policy? How did the story become so caricatured?
Why is the first part?
Why is Menzies' immigration policy just a White Australia policy caricature rather than what he actually did?
Because we're extremely ahistorical in a nutshell, given that Menzies inherited an Australia which was sort of adamantly committed to a really rigid application of the White Australia policy, with the dictation test as a form of racial exclusion, and also committed to protection policies for Aboriginal Australians, which was a form of racial segregation. And under Menzies, he begins to moderate and loosen up the White Australia policy, dismantles the dictation test, and sort of sets the scene for Holt to be able to essentially abolish it in 1966. And also with his Aboriginal Australians policy of assimilation, again, much denounced today and with some justifiable reason. But when you consider that its driving motivation was to ensure that all Australians are treated equally and have the same chance in life, I think it's extremely ahistorical to just broadly condemn those measures of his.
Alex McDermott, thank you so much for your excellent work on this exhibition and for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks.
History matters because ideas matter. Thank you for listening to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. To follow more of our work, subscribe to the podcast and visit robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. I'm Georgina Downer. Until next time.